Now, where I'm from is very easy to illustrate. If you look on a national map of the whole United States, you will see the Mississippi, a little finger of the little thread of the Mississippi going up north and up near the top. It forms a backward question mark. And you can see it even on a world map. Well, for 50 miles, the Mississippi runs west to east. And in that section is a chain of lakes, many of which have Indian reservations on them. Now, this is a very wet country. It's very poor for farming. It's 50% swamp and lake and bog. And members of my family did winter logging. Logging trucks would drive over the ice to pine islands in the middle of lakes and harvest timber. Now, my grandparents moved to this particular place in 1905. It was only 5 miles from Highway 2 in the main line, but electricity did not come there until 1952. Before that, it was kerosene lamps. Now, my father and his brothers went to the famous Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, which is where Jim Thorpe first made his fame as an American athlete. They came back to their area, and he married my grandmother, who had an allotment of land in a much more fertile part of western Minnesota on the White Earth Reservation. Now that was suitable for agriculture, tractors, grain silos, and everything. And he talked her into giving up that allotment for land in his area, which is 90% bog. But they had a happy marriage. My aunts and uncles were born in sets of 3 in 1904, 1906, and 1910. My mother was the beginning of the second batch, 1918, 1920, 1923, and of course the last one went to war when he was 20 years old in 1943. Now, because my grandfather and his brothers had the equivalent of a high school education, when probably half the whites surrounding the reservation did not graduate from high school. It didn't make my grandfather intellectual, but it made him very good at fixing cars and appreciating knowledge. And he even bought an upright piano for my mother's younger sister when she was going to high school. And so both the oldest, born in 1904, and the youngest knew how to read music and could play along. I mean, back in those days, everybody learned music, but these Indians were included. So, when I was a child in the late 40s, I went ice fishing with my grandfather. And most lakes in Minnesota are ice block lakes, chunks of glacier that were left behind when the glacier receded, making great big pits. And ours is a medium-sized lake, 11 miles long and 2 miles wide. And in the winter, well, because these lakes are formed the way they fill in from the sides, they don't fill in from the streams. And so the drop-off is very close. My grandfather had lived there a long time. He knew where the drop-off was. He drove stakes to market so that when the ice froze, when the lake froze over, he would know, and even before that, he would set nets to guide the fish towards where he was going to put the fish house. And so that way he would locate it. The nets would channel the fish to a point. And I went with him one time, and he had a decoy that he had carved. He moved it up and down. It had little wings on it. It went up and down. and a northern pike came in, stuck and missed. And went around the second time. My grandfather was getting ready, and this time he speared it and brought it inside and killed it right away. And we had it to eat less than 45 minutes later. And so it was a female, and so there were northern pike carrier. That if you tried, that was a delicacy too. Now, I think at that time they were on something like $35 a month old age assistance. I mean, they had some Social Security, but it wasn't very much in those days. And so they went hunt. They were on an open reservation, which means they were subject to the same hunting and fishing rules that white people were on. So during season, I went hunting with one of their sons, one of my uncles. While they were duck hunting, and boom, 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 I had a dog that swam out and brought them back for a pat on the top of the head. Now, they also went racing. The lake not far away that was wholly owned by an Indian who really knew how to do business. And his rice beds would put 20 men to work in canoes for a couple of weeks when they were ready to harvest. And so my uncle and my grandfather gave us 50 pounds of wild rice every fall. And that's what we grew up on instead of oatmeal. We would have wild rice with whitefish and boiled whitefish. That's a Chippewa delicacy. And so one time I watched them thresh wild rice. And so you jacked up an automobile, took off the wheel, put on a belt, and the belt turned a 54-gallon oil drum over some flames. And this would crack the husk on the wild rice. So, and we had birch bark baskets to throw it up and let the wind carry the chaff away. It was very beautifully home independent. These times I was probably 8 and 10 years old.
You?
Yes, I was 8 or 10 years old when this was going on. Maybe less, maybe 6 or 7. It was about in 1940, 48, 47. And so my grandfather got the Duluth News Tribune in the mailbox. They got a Saturday Evening Post. They got a few things. You know, they were not illiterate. My grandmother was almost illiterate because she was kicked out of school for being deaf when she was 12. She never had any formal education after the age of 12. And I still have part of a reader in the Chippewa language. Of all people in my family, my grandmother, my mother's mother, the one who went deaf, is the only one who was fluent in the language in the family she grew up in. And that was lost.
And that was...
and she was... and so this was... This is Chippewa. Now, a word about the Chippewa language. I spoke before about the fishhook part of the state of Mississippi. Well, from eastern North Dakota, one branch of the Chippewa brought forth Louise Erdrich, the Indian writer, the Native American writer, Louise Erdrich. Okay, the Algonquin language goes all across within 100 or 200 miles of the Great Lakes. It goes south from New York and halfway down the Mid-Atlantic coast. That is the Algonquin language group. In Algonquin in Quebec, Cree around Lake Superior, and Chippewa as far as the south. The Sioux Indians, mighty crazy horse, Sitting Bull, all of these great Plains Indians, their families lived in Minnesota and were driven out onto the plains about 1700. And so they're really Johnny-come-latelys, but they learned well, they learned fast, and they learned well. And all over Minnesota now, not when I was a kid, there are historical markers on this or that lake of battles between Indian bands for control of the fur trade. And these are all derived from primary sources left by the fur trapping companies. And so, Minnesota being as flat as it is, I mean in the north, all the lakes are canoeable. So all of the state was explored by canoe, except the north shore of Lake Superior. And so my grandparents raised 6 kids, and before they had chainsaws, he had to cut tons and tons of firewood to feed the stoves in the winter. I was there in January 1950, and it got to 55 below zero, official. And this means that the ice, I digress. My cousin, my first cousin who lived next door practically, took my brother and myself out onto the middle of Ball Club Lake, and the ice had been blown clear of snow by the wind. You looked at it, you could see bubbles in the ice that were like more than 3 feet beneath. You could have landed a 747 on ice like this. And it was polished like glass. And we saw something interesting up ahead, and we went up to it. We got near it, and it was a pressure ridge. And suddenly we realized that this had been open water that had just refrozen, and all 3 of us were skating on ice that was less than 2 inches thick, and we could see cracks radiating all around us. And we were kids. I mean, like 9, 11, and my cousin was 15, and we knew this was death. And we got back to solid ice. And it's something that all of us remember 50 years later. I mean, it was one of the first times we ever realized we could die. And they never would have found us because we were out in the middle of the lake. Up. So I had a rabbit snare route. I wasn't to be trusted with a gun. Oh yes. I went hunting with my brother, and the snow was no more than ankle deep through the woods. Both had .22s, and we came upon a rabbit right in front of us, 10 feet away, hunkered down, trying not to be noticed. And so, point blank, I raised my gun, pulled the trigger, and it was a dead shell. I put in a second one and brought the gun closer, like 2 feet away. The rabbit didn't move. Another dead shell. I put in another one and put the barrel right against the rabbit's head, and it didn't move. And I pulled the trigger, and it was a dead shell. And I raised it, I gave it a little kick with my foot, and I said, "Young day," you know, and I hopped away. And so that's the closest I've ever come to killing anything. I'm absolutely nothing as an Indian hunter. I sound so nostalgic. I've been telling you what it was like to have been an innocent child, watching my grandfather when he was still healthy and able to do everything he had to do. When my grandparents became too feeble to do all of this stuff, even though they had propane gas, one of their sons had installed propane so they didn't have to cut wood. They had electricity, so they did not have to use kerosene lamps anymore. But they still had an outhouse to which they would have to walk a snowy path in the winter, and they had dizzy spells, especially my grandfather, and facing a real possibility that one of them would faint outside on the path to the outhouse, and the other would not be able to drag him or her up. And so my mother was desperate to keep them out of the county home. And the county home did not discriminate against Indians. There were both white people and Indians in the county home. But mother borrowed everything she could to buy a small house in St. Paul, and the grandparents moved in with us. And at this time, my mother remarried my father 2 weeks before I went off to college. I never lived with them for any length of time again, except for this fatal winter. I think she needed my father to control my brother. And she visited what happened was that when I graduated from high school, my mother told my Aunt Bess, my father's elder sister, that his son had graduated from high school. And so
Shut up. Cody. Okay.
I'll wait until it calms down.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. My father was informed that I had graduated from high school, and I got a check for $5 in the mail. And he and my mother started talking on the phone. They could both hear. And it turned out that she sent me down to Moline, Illinois to live with him for a couple of weeks as an experiment. And at that time, now my father had gone only to the 9th grade in the local school, but he went to an Indian trade school in Flanders, South Dakota, and graduated when he left. He was a skilled welder and a butcher. So he moved to the Washington, D.C. area and was soon a miracle man. He was so good that he was entrusted with very important jobs, such as taking welding equipment to the top of a 1,500-foot radio tower. My father was proud of having been able to fix boilers. We had hundreds of feet of pipe inside, and he would be able to find the right one by feel. And so when he met my mother at an American Indian Center in Washington, D.C., he had a white 1941 convertible, a Ford. He made $7,000 in the year 1941, which was, Google says it's $130,000 now. And so he was a catch. He was a catch. He impregnated my mother. She graduated in 1941. In spring 1941, Calvert College, Washington, D.C., the National College for the Deaf. So Then he was transferred to work in shipyards in Long Beach, California. And my mother went with him. I was an infant. I was born November 15th, 1941, so I'm a pre-war baby. Not even a war baby or a post-war baby, but a pre-war baby by 3 weeks. So, when the war ended, they moved back to Chicago. And one of my father's sisters ran the American Indian Center in Chicago. It was underneath L. I vaguely remember that. Then came the divorce. And my mother and I and my brother moved from apartment to apartment to apartment from about 1947 until 1956. 57 when they bought their first house, when my mother bought her first house. So my brother and I grew up 3 people in 1-bedroom apartments. So when I left my family in 1962, none of my father's family lived in the Twin Cities. But in the 50 years since I left, several branches, my father's sister and her progeny moved to St. Paul in Minneapolis. So my second cousin is now a lawyer for the Bad River tribe. Now, my mother's band of Chippewa are from the White Earth Band of Minnesota Chippewa. My father's band is the Bad River Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. And so, my Bentley name comes from a veteran of the Revolutionary War named Bentley, whose progeny moved east and wound up on the Indian reservation in southern Wisconsin. And so, my father's sister married a big, tall, bohemian auto worker who loved to make potato pancakes, who could bend sheet metal with his fingers. He was enormous. And they bought a small resort near Ashland, Wisconsin, about 15 miles inland from Lake Superior. They owned the entire lake and a corridor to a bigger lake. And so starting in the 40s, they had a little resort where you had little teeny-weeny cabins for factory workers from the Chicago area that had a little stove for heating dinner, little wood stoves. I think they had a water heater and running water, and that was pretty much it, a couple of shop utensils. But this was a way for people in the hot city to get away for a few days. And so they had a very low cost clientele. But my father's sister had graduated from the local college.
How many sisters?
The only sister that counts is my father's sister, who became a school teacher. And so, when they raised their child in suburban Chicago, Aunt Beth was a substitute teacher in the school system. And they lived in Brookfield, and on hot nights, you could hear the lions roaring when it was feeding time. They were that close to the zoo. And so, Aunt Beth and Allie Beth, their daughter, valued education, good spelling, good rigor, real credit. Even when I wrote her schoolboy letters, she returned them with corrections. And so, Allie Beth learned how to play the piano. And I can still remember her playing one of Bach's 3-part inventions. So her daughter became a lawyer and worked for Ruth Erdrich.
Yeah.
So my second cousin Ari, and my second cousin Phoebe, graduated in Native American Studies from the University of Minnesota and took courses in Chippewa language. And this is the big difference. When I was growing up, being an Indian was something you could be ashamed of because you were an underclass. It wasn't that the white people had the right to children like they had in the South. We weren't like Negroes and whites up there. We were just an underclass. But there is no special pride in being an Indian now. You've got Chippewa language courses in community centers. I mean, you can major in Chippewa studies if you want to. I mean, it's popular. I mean, it's nationwide. And I never really knew about it the first time I used to get catalogs from University of Arizona and New Mexico Press. But now, if you want to, you can get audio recordings. You can become almost get the foreign service level in Chippewa if you really put enough time into it because the materials are there. And in the mill, in there are doctoral dissertation writers on every conceivable aspect of Native life. And they're all competing for the same few Native speakers, most of which are in Canada now. Now, in one of Louise Erdrich's books, she mentioned she bypassed the suicide of her husband, Michael Torres, who wrote a wonderful book about fetal alcohol syndrome. And they wrote a book together about Columbus, about what Columbus meant for the American Indian. They wrote a book together. So Louise Erdrich had won the National Book Award at least once. And as I said before, she is from the westernmost branch of the Chippewa, which are out on the North Dakota plains. They were not Lake Indians like the rest of them. And so, when Louise Erdrich fell in love after her husband's death, she fell in love with an Indian man, with a Canadian, a Cree, who lived in a tribe that was on the north shore of Lake of the Wood, which is where the 49th parallel, the northern border, makes this little jog up. And you could see how she wished it was almost like a modern suburban Jew wishing he had enough Yiddish or Hebrew to really get into what a native speaker of Yiddish would feel. I mean, there's this, you talk about nostalgia, and there are very serious intellectual ways to expand and fill in that nostalgia these days, because the education level is so much higher. There's a newspaper devoted to defending Indian tribal lands all across Lake Superior against the encroachments of the mining companies. Now, the Bad River tribe made the New York Times a year and a half ago because a giant company called GTAC, Go-Chubbuck Taconite, had acquired iron deposits in the headwaters of their river, of their self-named river. And it went all through, they got a lot of support. And this being Washington, D.C., the tribe hired big-time special lawyers in Washington. This is too specialized a topic for my cousin who was a general practice lawyer. So that Scott Walker, the tribe successfully delayed the Gojeba Taconite project long enough for the recession to come and the bottom to fall out of the market. And it would have been a great big job holder for Scott Walker. And Scott Walker hates the Chippewa for robbing him of what would have been a great triumph. That's my father's side of the family. Now, that's on the south shore of Lake Superior. And Lake Superior has an average temperature of 42 degrees. It's so cold that ships going across the lake have to have survival suits. You have to get into a survival suit before you get into the lifeboat, because the water will kill you in 5 minutes. It's terribly cold. That's why there are no bathing beaches on Lake Superior, and very few on Lake Michigan. And so, the tribe had a small fishing business. They had rising beds, but it was still the culture of poverty. And now everything is so much better. I mean, the schools are better, the bureaucracy is better. When I worked on the Red Lake Reservation, you could send kids to the Haskell Institute, which was grade 8th grade and up in Haskell, Kansas, the National School for Indian Arts in Santa Fe. I can't think of the third. They had 2 more that I can't remember right now. But these were national boarding schools where Indians would meet all other Indians. I mentioned that my mother had 5 sibs.
Not your father. Your father.
No, my father, I don't know how many sibs, but I know he had at least 2 sisters. One was my Aunt Bess, and the other was Anne Marie or something like that. And I did not know that side of the family before I left home in 1962. I knew nothing about that side of the family. I had met Aunt Beth once or twice. I knew nothing about it. It was the absolute. My mother had nothing to do with it. I mean, she didn't want me contaminated with booze. And so I escaped the actual alcoholism, but I got good, classic, well-behaved Indian guilt. And so, I mean, it's just as good as Jewish guilt. I mean, I work my fingers to the bone and you don't appreciate it. You know, you got all these books on you study, why not this, why not that, and you just like your roaring drunken father. I mean, I really didn't want to know anything about them. And so, in my life, I've had relationships with only one alcoholic woman. I withstood her for only a very short while. I have a very low tolerance for people with alcohol problems. I consider that good fortune that I never had a taste for alcohol. Now I am a pothead. I love pot, and I can't see anybody drinking alcohol at me because it only makes me sick and it doesn't make me high. But I had nothing to do with it. I think since I left home, I'm more of, if I'm handicapped by anything, it's more by deafness than by anything of being Indian. Yeah. Now, in 1969, I worked on the only closed reservation in Minnesota. There are 5 others that are all a very small corps surrounded by white people and white laws for hunting and fishing. And this one, a relative of the tribal chairman, the family name of Jordan, went crazy in high school, Bed Lake High School. He shot and killed 7 people from Red Lake High School in the early 90s. I don't remember the exact situation, but 1969. Now, I went around. I was hired by the Employment Service. My main job was to try to sell Job Corps and trade school opportunities in competition with the BIA. No, this was afterwards. There's much afterwards. Now, I lived in Aspen between 62 and 65. Then I went off and finished college in 1968. And in 1969, I was working on the Red Lake Reservation. Okay. And I was selling job training programs in competition with the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the state and other charities. I never really had a chance. But I went door to door on the reservation over about 80 miles of main road. And I found almost nothing but suspicion. The kid wasn't here. They'd already done that. I conducted little tests, armed forces tests. And so one of my worst memories of this is that I was to give the general aptitude test battery to 2 girls and a boy. The girls were high school students. The boy had dropped out when he was 10 or something. And the instructions for the test, it was all multiple choice. And you had to add 2 numbers. And to my surprise, I mean, the girls understood it right away, and the boy, who had beautiful skin, even today, I'm 70 years old, I look back, and this kid had beautiful skin and beautiful structure in his face. He could have been a model in a magazine. And he did not know how to read that test. He did not know how to read the instructions. He could not read the questions. And I realized, I said, well, I was speechless. I couldn't imagine illiteracy at that level, at that age. And he was very, very embarrassed, and I could just feel the hate in his eyes. When we finished up, and I tried to say, well, go back to school, and you won't have this happen to you anymore. And so I had other cases that weren't quite that bad. And I found myself saying, join the Army or the Navy. And the year before, I'd been an active anti-war protester. And for me to suggest a young man to join the Army during the Vietnam War was an act of desperation. Anything to get them off the res. And so, I don't know if they did that, but Of course, I was never one of them. To make a long story short, I started to have anxiety attacks, and I left because I was going crazy. I thought I was going crazy. And so that was the end of my Indian reservation journey. My wife was a good liberal. She wanted me or the Indians to be as good as other people. But what she saw was intellectual poverty. And this was before all this nostalgia business came up of learning the language, all of this. No, out of the question. I mean, we lived in Bemidji, the county seat of Beltrami County, and I commuted 30 miles up to the reservation every day. And none of the workers, the state and federal workers, none of them lived on the reservation. Everybody was outside. If you saw a new car, that person had to be employed in some way, working for the bureaucracy or something. Very few Indians did that. I went to the other side of the world by moving to Athens. And my brother loved Minnesota. My brother had a much better time than I did. Sure. Good. Let's go.